When he fell face down into a plate of hot grape broth, no one dared approach him immediately. One of the valets dropped a candelabra, another turned pale but remained standing, as if waiting to see whether he would be struck, reprimanded, or given silent approval for intervening. Papa did not move. His face was submerged in the yellow liquid, his hands were twisted, his nails dug into the edge of the table. Almost 2 minutes passed before the doctor Osvaldo was called. He found the pontiff unconscious, breathing with a putrid odour. Alexandre VI, the uncrowned god of Rome and head of all the predators of the Vatican, began to die on Friday evening, in the middle of August, in the heat of the Roman summer, when the blood cools in the stagnant fountains and rats fight in the underground kitchens. His body, heavy with age and poison, began to emit a heat unnatural for an old man. The first thing they noticed was his forehead, covered in sweat, and his glassy eyes. Then the vomiting began, dark red, with the smell of vinegar and rotten fish. The next morning, his belly began to swell. According to a note from a monk assigned to the royal chambers, his skin was stretched like a bull's bladder. When touched, it sounded like a ball. His belly was rippling. My father was washed with diluted wine and vinegar compresses were applied, but to no avail. His body continued to heat up from within. One of the doctors who arrived from Naples declared that it was not the plague or stomach fever, but inflammation of the internal juices. Officially, the disease was recognized as a natural consequence of summer dampness and excessive fatigue. But behind the scenes, people were talking about something else. Shortly before his seizure, the day before the meal, Alexander held a private mass with 3 cardinals. Afterwards, one of them disappeared. His body was later found in a cesspool under the chapel of St. Clement, with his joints dislocated and his stomach empty. The other 2 refused to make public appearances and demanded to leave the palace, citing a sudden darkness of consciousness. Security at the Pope's chambers was tightened. It was forbidden to walk in the corridors after sunset. All the mirrors in the pontiff's bedroom were covered with black cloth. By Monday morning, the Pope no longer recognized faces. He shouted that the room was filled with dogs without eyes, and that wills were whispering on the ceiling. Foam mixed with black blood came out of his mouth. According to Chamberlain Filippo, the moment I turned the pillow, he clutched my wrist and said he could hear the devil breathing in his own spleen. My father began to be treated according to the usual method for the end of the century. Copious bloodletting, at least 200 grams in the morning and evening, rubbing with oil and cloves, hot stones on the stomach, and a mixture of ground chalk and saffron under the tongue. In addition, a pharmacist was called to prepare an ointment from roasted wine lees mixed with arsenic and honey. This was applied to his chest. After the procedure, flies began to die in the room. Alexander was silent. During the day, he lay with his mouth open, staring at the ceiling. At night, he moaned and twitched. According to the monk Luigi's notes, he repeated 3 words, never changing their order: sun, cup, wax. When they tried to give him wormwood broth, he screamed so loudly that one of the guards' ears began to bleed. 6 doctors took turns at his bedside. One left Rome, taking with him a box of papers and a small glass flask containing the contents of the pontiff's stomach. He was killed on the road. The papers were never found. Another drowned in a fountain in his own clothes. Later, a letter was found in which he wrote, "I saw his veins moving. It was as if someone was crawling under his skin." Panic broke out in the Vatican. The cardinals stopped meeting. Ambassadors demanded explanations. Rumours spread that the pontiff had been poisoned. Some claimed that the poison had been sent back. That is, the poison intended for the enemy had been drunk by the Pope himself. Other reports said that his body would not accept death because it had been sold to the devil. The walls of the bedroom were hung with crucifixes. A circle of salt was drawn on the floor. Candles were placed in the corners. One of the monks whispered that someone has been scraping his stomach from the inside all night. Meanwhile, the body was changing. On the 5th day, his face turned black. His cheeks swelled up. His eyelids would not close. His lips were cracked. A black liquid flowed from his anus. His stomach swelled to such an extent that it had to be tied with 3 bandages. His ribs could no longer be felt. His pulse disappeared. but his heart was still beating, slowly, heavily, once every half minute. The last attempt to ease his suffering was to rub opium mixed with incense into his gums. This caused him to foam at the mouth. Alexander screamed and swallowed his own tongue. It was pulled out with tongs. After that, he was completely silent, but he was still breathing. On the seventh day, the body did not breathe its last, but everything else did. The air in the pontiff's chambers became thick as pus. The guards no longer entered. They only placed food at the door. The doctors disappeared. Only 2 monks remained, who did not speak to each other and recorded the Pope's condition every 3 hours. According to their reports, his skin temperature remained abnormally high, despite the fact that his fingernails had already begun to peel off and his eyes were completely dry. One of the monks noted that when the Pope's chest was lightly pressed, air rushed out of his mouth, like an organ pipe, with the smell of sulphur and burnt hair. The priests who were tasked with preparing Alexander for confession were unable to enter his chambers. One, Francesco del Mondo, ran out into the corridor at the sight of the body, covering his face with his claws until they bled. The second disappeared. Only his shoes and an overturned wine cup remained in his cell. The third, an old man named Restez, ran into the room and shouted, "I forgive you! I forgive you!" but fell before reaching the bed and choked on his own vomit. The Pope did not confess. No rites were performed. The cardinals, realizing that Alexander was still breathing and not dead, began to negotiate among themselves. Bargaining ensued. Who would enter the College of Successors? Who would take the keys to the treasury? Who would declare death, even if the heart was still beating? One of the informers from the Borgia's inner circle wrote, "They waited for someone to be the first to say aloud, 'He is dead,' but no one dared while he was still breathing." Meanwhile, the body began to make noises. According to the memoirs of the notary Leonardo M., on the night of August 9th, there were loud noises coming from the Pope's stomach, as if bones were knocking against each other. Once we heard a voice, hollow and damp, as if speaking through cloth. It said, "It's not time yet." The chambers began to collapse. A crack formed in the ceiling. Plaster crumbled over the headboard. The windowsill turned black, and flies swarmed the window so that no light could pass through. The guards demanded masks. Candles went out in the corners. Traces appeared on the walls, handprints, as if someone had run their fingers across the stone from the inside. On the 10th day, his heart stopped. The pontiff was not breathing, but his body was still warm. His stomach swelled even more, his chest cracked. The room was filled with a stench reminiscent of a mixture of boiling lard and carrion. The doctors refused to perform an autopsy. The only one who agreed to approach was Matteo, a pharmacist from Ostia, a man without rank. He described, "A cut opened on his chest by itself. Something between honey and boiled blood flowed out of it. The smell made me vomit. Inside there were no organs, only black slime that moved in the light." The cardinals insisted on embalming. The body was transferred to the lower crypt for the procedure. On the way, the bandages slipped off. The skin was coming away from the flesh. 3 bearers later complained of a burning sensation in their palms. One of them lost the skin on his hands. The embalming was unsuccessful. The flesh absorbed neither vinegar nor incense. All the ointments ran off as if they were wax. When attempting to insert spices into the abdominal cavity, one of the assistants said he felt resistance, as if something inside pushed my finger away. The body was placed in a wooden coffin into which bags of salt, chalk and herbs were thrown. It was closed and filled with resin, but by morning the coffin had swollen. The lid rose, the resin cracked. One of the monks said he doesn't want to be walled up. Meanwhile, a struggle began in the halls of the Vatican. Manuscripts disappeared. Papers with Alexander's signatures were burned. The keys to the archives were changed. People from the Borgia family disappeared, either leaving secretly or being killed. The Pope's body was kept in isolation. No ceremony was held. No mass was said in his honour. From a letter from the Spanish ambassador to the king, they say that he did not die alone, that something else lived in his body, that he died, but that something remained, and that means that the election of a new pontiff will not be a purification, but a transfer, and we do not know to whom. The body disappeared on the night of the 11th day. The coffin, placed in the lower crypt, was found empty. The salt bags lay torn, the wood was rotten, and the lid had popped off as if from strong internal pressure. The servants who entered the room before dawn claimed that the corridors were filled with steam, like in a bathhouse, smelling of ashes and old wine. One of them, a German servant named Gerhard, later recounted, "I was walking down the stairs and felt the air become sticky. I was drawn back as if into the depths. When I entered, the coffin was empty. There were marks on the wall as if someone had climbed out wiping their hands." Panic broke out instantly. The cardinals locked themselves in the halls of the conclave, refusing to leave even for short meetings. The courtyard was cleared of servants, the monastery of its inhabitants. The Vatican was blockaded. For 3 days, no one entered or left. The smoke from the burning papers was visible from the other side of the Tiber. Inside, the archives were burning. The apothecary's register was the first to go up in flames. Then came the records of the last mass. Even the reports of the Borgia clans, which had previously been kept in golden boxes in a special crypt, were burned. It was said that one of the cardinals, Giovanni de Mora, tried to escape with a genuine copy of the pontiff's will, but he was stopped. He disappeared. His body was found later, without a tongue and with burned pupils. Meanwhile, rumours began to spread. The first to speak was a cook from a convent adjacent to the Vatican. At night, she heard someone walking barefoot on the marble floors. Then there were complaints about the smell. In the east wing, the walls exuded miasma, despite the lack of ventilation. In the library of the Sistine Chapel, someone once opened a cabinet. The books inside were damp, the pages stuck together, and on the shelves there were handprints like those left by corpse wax. Priests began to leave Rome. 2 of the 13 who were at court were killed. The rest disappeared or fell ill. According to a report by the city doctor, one had blood coming out of his ears, another tore out his fingernails, and a third screamed that someone was living in his intestines and asking to come out. By the beginning of September, the Vatican was paralysed. No mass was celebrated, the choir was silent. The bells did not ring. From the report of the French ambassador, the walls have turned black. The stairs are slippery as if covered in lard. People whisper that the pontiff has returned, but not as a man. At night, a figure was seen in the chapel, tall, in a decaying robe with his face covered by the papal tiara. He stood at the altar and swayed from side to side. One of the guards tried to call out to him. He was later found dead. Both his legs were broken, his tongue had been swallowed, and his eyes had been gouged out. Later, the cardinals attributed the incident to unclean fantasies, but access to the chapel was closed from a letter by the monk Salvatore, who was exiled to Messina. "We are no longer sure who we are burying, or if we are not burying him at all. His flesh has disappeared, but he remains in stone, in wood, in the breath between masses. We feel his gaze upon us." People began to gather at the outer gates. They demanded explanations. People waited for a sign. 3 monks began to preach right on the bridge. They shouted that a demon had settled in the Vatican and that the Pope was not a man but a shell. One of them threw himself into the Tiber. Another began to tear his skin, claiming that beneath it was the shadow of the pontiff. It became impossible to hide. Then a decree was issued. Alexandre VI was declared dead from natural poisoning by internal toxins due to overheating and bodily decay. However, no mention was made of the body. The official letter to the Spanish king did not contain the words burial, remains, or sarcophagus. The cardinals hastily gathered to elect a new pontiff. The vote took place in complete silence. No one argued, no one looked each other in the eye. A bag with scraps of vestments was thrown out of the window. They were black with dried blood. The new pope was elected without discussion. His name was not spoken aloud, but whispered in the hall, where the windows were curtained and even the candles were not lit until the signatures were affixed. It was a compromise, an elderly, neutral, weak man with no connections. The main thing was that he was alive. No one demanded a mass for the repose of his soul. Not a single bell tolled in honour of his accession. His first act was to order the lower crypt to be sealed. Everything related to the body of Alexander VI had to disappear. books, records, lists of witnesses, medical reports. The wall where the coffin had once stood was covered with new marble tiles without inscriptions. The room was locked for 3 days, then bricked up. The order was clear: prohibit access, mention, and memory. Official documents stated that the pontiff had died peacefully and was buried in the family tomb. In reality, no one could name the place of burial. Those who knew disappeared. One of the senior monks who was present at the embalming later tried to return to the Vatican. He was found dead in a tavern with his mouth filled with wax. All documents mentioning Alexander's last days were removed from the archives of the Holy Congregation. Some were kept in sealed scrolls with the inscription, "Do not open until the Last Judgment." They were later destroyed. In monasteries, the Pope's name was no longer mentioned. In the monastery of the Capuchin friars in Rome, the image of the Pope was replaced with that of the Virgin Mary. Some were kept in sealed scrolls marked, "Do not open until the Last Judgment." They were later destroyed. In monasteries, the name of the Pope was removed from the litany. His portraits were taken from the corridors and burned in ovens. The people said, "He lives as long as he is named." But even after that, the events did not stop. One of the new guards reported that he heard heavy footsteps on the slabs at night, as if bare feet were walking from the east toward the altar. Fresh scratches were found on the inner wall panelling of the crypt. Another servant came down with a fever, shouting, "He's inside. He's entered the vestments. He will serve again." Rumours spread throughout Rome. They said that the new pope locked himself in a room every night, where one wall was still warm, that he did not sleep, that he was forced to listen, and that sometimes he heard singing. Not prayers, singing from inside the floor. The Spanish crown demanded that Alexander's remains be handed over for reburial. The response was evasive. The body rests in peace and cannot be moved. A letter dated a month after the request contained the line, "For not all flesh is worthy of a tomb." Inside the Vatican, the disappearances continued. One of the cardinals began to see a face in his dreams, swollen, black, with bulging eyes. He wrote that it was not the devil, but the Pope himself, deprived of form, but not of power. He was taken to a monastery. 2 days later, his heart stopped, for no apparent reason. The last to disappear was the archivist. He kept copies of the records of Alexander's last days. Rumour had it that before his disappearance he tried to bury the scrolls in the garden of the monastery of St. Mary. The ground was later dug up. The papers were there, but they were oozing a liquid that looks like pus. Since then, the site has been closed and no grass grows there anymore. The name Alexander VI was officially banned from public utterance within the walls of the Vatican. The decree was signed by 36 cardinals. It does not use the word heresy, but it does use the expression defiled rite. He is called the Pope without liturgy, the only one for whom Mass was never celebrated. Rome began to forget. But the mould on the walls of the East Wing returns every August. Once a year, in the same week that he began to die, the candles in the Sistine Chapel dim of their own accord. And in one of the chapel's cupboards, a torn piece of white linen with a brown stain that cannot be washed out is still kept. And when someone uttered his name in the darkness above the papal tomb, the lights in the temple went out.